Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight on Speaking of Jazz with the West Michigan Jazz Society. Tonight, I am really excited that we're kicking off a celebration of Women's History Month. And to do that, we have a panel, a Women in Jazz Roundtable. I'm really excited about this. We have some incredible panelists with just the most incredible artistic backgrounds, and I can't wait for you to meet them all. But first, I'd like to talk about what we'll be doing in the coming weeks. On March 10, we have Rick Holland coming on the show. March 17 is Peter Lynn. And we have a couple more great shows booked out until actually the end of April. So if you or anybody that you know is interested in coming on the show, let me know. Either comment or send an email to, wmissjazz@gmail.com. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Crystal Rebone is a Chicago, Illinois-based bassist. bassist, okay. Clearly, I've never introduced anybody before. And she has played with a whole host of incredible musicians, including the great Marshall Jukes, Jim Pugh, Ernie Watts, and many, many others. She was the first female recipient of the David Baker Scholarship and is currently completing a Doctor of Musical Arts degree in jazz performance at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She holds an undergraduate degree from Western Illinois University and is a very in-demand teacher, performer, and all-around great human being. So I'm going to welcome Crystal and bid you all farewell until a much later time in the program. Thanks, everybody.
Hello. I hope our panel's going. There they go. Okay. So we're gonna go down the line and have all our panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start with Lisa.
Hello, my name is Lisa Sung. I live in Grand Rapids, and I teach jazz piano at Calvin University and Hope College. Dr. Jordan Van Hemer is my colleague, and I'm really happy to be on the show with you ladies all.
And then Cristina.
Hi, everyone.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, good. Hi, I'm Cristina Smith. I'm currently an undergraduate student at Central Michigan University. I play the trumpet, and I'm currently in Jazz Lab 1, which is the jazz ensemble at CMU, and I also dabble in politics. I'm the president of Michigan Federation of College Democrats. And yeah, so that's me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sharon Cho. I am a first-gen Korean American, a jazz vocalist, and DEI advocate. I currently serve as our senior instructional clinician and strategist at Quaver Ed. I was a former music teacher, and much like everyone here, I'm just elated to be joining you all, and thank you to Jordan and West Michigan for this platform.
I'm Robin Connell. I live in Grand Rapids, another pianist like Lisa. And all of the teaching for me now is in the past tense, not entirely by choice, but things happen, especially because of COVID. So, but yeah, I've been on the faculty in various places and Interlochen, for instance, for 20 summers with jazz, teaching jazz piano and jazz band and arranging. And I'm married. I have a stepson and a biological son that are full-grown young men. And my husband just retired. He was the band director at Aquinas College. Lived in New York City for 12 years. Basically, I've been a full-time musician my entire life since I graduated from college. I went on to graduate school. Sorry, it's a little bit longer because I'm 64 years old. I've got a bunch of stuff here, but I won't go on too long. I went to graduate school after being in New York City for those years, and got my degree in music composition, Doctor of Arts, and from the University of Northern Colorado. But I was a graduate teaching assistant and ran the combo program. There were 8 combos, and I directed the top combo and kind of oversaw the whole program. So that was my assistantship, basically. So anyway, just stuff like that, and I'll just stop there for now.
My name is Kaylee Wilder. I am a baritone saxophonist, and I identify as a free improviser. And I'm originally from Indiana, and I got my bachelor's degree at Ball State University. And then I currently live in Detroit, and what brought me up to the state of Michigan was going to grad school at the University of Michigan. I graduated in 2019, and so since then I've just been performing freelance in a couple bands, and working, and just sort of, I guess through the pandemic have really kind of honed in on what I want to do as a solo artist. And I'm still really kind of uncovering and returning to my voice. I guess I say that because when I was at Ball State University, I actually studied classical saxophone, but I was also, I was always involved in the jazz program and the large ensembles and combos and everything. And so I've been improvising since I was a kid, and have been, improvising in a jazz context since middle school and on. But now I've sort of returned to me just being like a free improviser, and kind of fitting into whatever context, be that jazz or classical or anywhere in between. So yeah.
All right, thank you all. I guess we're just gonna jump right in. So this first question is just pretty generic. What made you want to play or study jazz? Who would like to talk about their experience? Like, what sparked your interest? Anyone want to start? Okay, yeah.
I'll go. Well, I don't know. My experience with jazz started really, really young because my father is a jazz musician. He also plays the trumpet. So when I was really young, I mean, he was a big inspiration to me. Like, I always really wanted to sound like him, and I wanted to be able to play in like this amazing jazz band the way that he did. But it wasn't until I really got into middle school that I thought that it was something that I wanted for me. And both of my parents really kind of made music an important part of our lives. Like, my mom, she's from Mexico, and so her music is such an important part of her. And so I kind of found that later as well. And so kind of finding the influences of Latin music and jazz, I mean, that kind of changed who I was, and it kind of brought purpose to why playing music. It's different than other genres. I mean, jazz is, it's here, if that makes sense. It's in your soul. So I love that.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool to have a father jazz musician. My dad was an engineer, but he played amateur every day, came home and played by ear. So I grew up playing by ear. And then around age 7, I started taking lessons. So I learned how to read, I did the whole thing. And music was just constant all the time. And for the whole family, really. I was the youngest, and I kind of have to wait till it was my turn to practice and whatnot. But for jazz specifically, I did not really. I heard some jazz. I went to a couple concerts early on, but it didn't really register. I liked it, but didn't really register. But I improvised all the time, played by ear, improvised, and I was playing. I got way into. I loved dissonance. So even though the improvising at the piano was kind of new agey, I always put those dissonant things in there. I had no idea I was playing sharp 9 chords or augmented 5 chords. I didn't know what they were called. But so in college, I was already in my 20s, and I met a guy. He was teaching. His name was Eddie Ross at Grand Valley. By the way, that's in Grand Rapids. and he was playing at a restaurant downtown. And this is how naive I was. I walked into this restaurant, and he's playing a baby grand piano with an upright bass player. And I stood there looking at them, and I thought to myself, I think they're playing jazz. But I was just I didn't know. But I really liked it. So I asked if I could take lessons. And that's kind of how I started to bridge all those things I had been doing with actually listening. So back then, without all the stuff we have now, I mean, you couldn't just turn on the radio and hear jazz. I mean, you had to really search for it. I don't think there was anything in Grand Rapids, for instance, back then. But then the thing that really threw me over the edge was when I had a boyfriend from Chicago, and still in college, and I went there, and he took me to hear Joseph Jarman. And I don't know if you know his name, but he was in the Chicago Art Ensemble, but this was a solo concert. And I went head over heels. And I just remember sitting there listening to him and thinking, I don't know what the heck he's doing, but I love it. So that was my hook right there. So that's pretty much it. And from then on, that's just the direction I went as much as I could. Mute.
Oh, is there anyone else? Because the next question kind of ties into this as well. So my research is investigating perceptions of female, women, and non-binary students and their reason for joining jazz band. And something I've been noticing is just always wondering how impactful was their middle school experiences and their high school experiences. And so that's the next question, which can kind of tie into what made you want to play and study. So how, for where you are now, how much can be negative or positive did your high school and middle school experiences influence you? Who would like to start?
I can start. We talked a little bit about this before we were live streaming, and when I think about my middle school experience and my high school experience, I wish I could say that it was impactful in where I am now, because I think music ensembles build those soft skills like teamwork and listening. But honestly, there was just such a lack of diversity in jazz ensembles at my schools, and it was intimidating enough that I never joined. I wasn't in music ensembles in middle school, and in high school, we didn't have a jazz ensemble that I could join because there wasn't an invitation for singers. I think a lot of times the voice isn't considered an instrument. And so I have sort of put together trios and had small bands to perform in variety shows. And it really wasn't until my final years of high school and into college that I had professors or directors who encouraged jazz. And, even my college experience, I was a music ed student, and I was also part of the jazz program, but kind of holding that dual role. Typically, the music ed degree is built off the foundations of classical courses and ensembles. And so it was quite frowned upon that I was trying to do both. And a lot of my professors, with the exception of my classical voice professor, was very vocal in their opinions about me wasting time in the jazz department rather than auditioning for operas or taking more classically foundationed courses. And I think people get uncomfortable, especially people with power, when you try to push against the norm as a student. But I am who I am because of the resilience born out of a series of no's. Even being Korean American, there's an inherent double consciousness. And so I'm very used to being told no and asking to conform to the norm. And I think it's brought me to be the jazz musician that I am, because I want to be bold and I want to kind of push against the norm and be there for others to say, you can do it. You can look different. You can like makeup and like jazz too. And, kind of share that message.
Anyone want to go off of that?
Yeah. So I guess for me, it wasn't. The reason I say that I don't identify as a jazz musician now is that not that you have to go through a university or institution to learn jazz. I mean, the founders of this music, they didn't have that. It wasn't, it's only become institutionalized in the last, 30 years or so. And so for me, what Robin was saying actually really resonates. Always playing by ear, really liking dissonance, that kind of thing. I always improvised as a kid. playing things on keyboard by ear, or, making up songs, lyrics, just sort of like as I went. And then I started playing saxophone, and really that is what brought me down a classical path, especially just, where I grew up being in Indiana. There wasn't a whole lot of, live music and jazz. That wasn't really, I didn't know a lot about it. And so, I kind of stuck with this classical path all through, my undergrad. But when I was, I guess, where I grew up, I was one of, I think, few kids who really, really took music seriously. Like, I've known my whole life that music is what I want to do in my life. And so I had that laser sort of focus, I guess, all through middle school and high school. And I had teachers that really nurtured that. I started studying privately the summer between 5th and 6th grade. And so, I was really serious going into middle school and, of course, in high school. And so, my teachers saw that, and I was always, like a section leader, or, first chair in like middle school band, high school band, jazz band, lead alto, that kind of thing. And so I always felt like nurtured in that way because my teachers, saw how dedicated I was, and I was studying privately, so I was definitely advanced for my age. And then going to college, I actually didn't. My high school band director was definitely, we didn't really get along very well, and so I actually didn't do any jazz playing my freshman year of college, and I really missed it. And so then my sophomore year, I auditioned for the jazz, like the large ensembles, and that kind of got me started again. And that actually was my switch to playing baritone. So I was pretty much exclusively an alto player, a little bit of soprano, saxophone, but the Barry chair opened up in the top jazz band when I was a sophomore in college. And so then that sort of was the start of me really pursuing Barry, and I'd always wanted to play Barry, but since I was like lead alto, I had to be the lead player all the time, so I could never get to explore that part of myself. And so yeah, I think for me, like, jazz was a lot about big band. The big band, we went on 2 European tours in my undergrad, and so I got to see a lot of things through the music. But I'm still very much like in my evolution. And I look back now, and, jazz in middle school, high school, it wasn't a foundation in truly the soul, as Cristina said, of the music. There was no mention of, this being Black music. I never heard that until grad school. I had never, of course I knew, because of seeing the musicians who I was transcribing and everything, but no one, sometimes it just takes someone to say that one thing that like kind of turns the light bulb on. And so for me, going to Michigan for grad school and being in a department where students were calling this Black music, it really sort of like made me dive into it in a different way. And so part of why I don't call myself a jazz musician, and why I really identify as an improviser or free improviser, I've been deeply influenced and inspired by jazz, but I haven't done necessarily the same work that I think is necessary. I don't always think that I'm fully doing a service to the music, to the lineage of the music. And so that's sort of why I make that distinction is, I don't want to take away from people who have dedicated their lives to this music. And that's, I'm still figuring things out as an artist. And so, that could totally change. And language and labeling, changes for all of us, I'm sure, over time anyway. But yeah, I guess it's been an interesting path to get here. But I've definitely felt nurtured and supported, I'd say, in that path. There were, of course, times when maybe I wasn't, but yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. That's wonderful. What I wanted to share my story a little bit. I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm a 1.5 generation Korean American. I came to America when I was 13. So my parents owned a little grocery store right in the inner city of Philadelphia. And my dad would pick me up after school every day to work in the store, right? So right where my dad's store was, right next to it, there was a church, an African American church. And then like maybe couple days a week, they will have a rehearsal. And then I could just hear the B3 organ and like this sound that just I never and Robin was talking about the dissonance. I just never thought that hymn can be sung that way or played that way. So from middle school to high school years, I grew up listening to it, and Philadelphia being such a rich in art, there was just music everywhere. And what I really appreciate about American school education, especially in the arts, back in 80s and 90s, I mean, still going on, but the theater, right, was I played for a lot of the musicals. Some Gershwins and like Kiss Me Kate, those old musicals that just really I've learned so much from it. So it was such a great experience for me to just experience like jazz chords that I've never really played before. So I really appreciate all that education that I got.
Awesome. So trying to think. So this kind of ties into that. So early on, were there any female role models for you? Because again, I'm going back on all this research. There's a lot of mixed feelings on it. Like some research is like, oh yeah, this is really influential, and others it's like, oh, it really didn't matter as much. So for all of you, like, were there any like female musicians that you knew of growing up that like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do? Because for me, my first experience with a female jazz musician was with Marlene Rosenberg, who's a bassist in Chicago, and she was on tour with Western Illinois, which is where I ended up going, mostly because she was there. Well, when I went there, she wasn't, but she was the reason I looked into that school. And after that, like I think the second one I ever heard of was Esperanza Spalding. Like, yeah, it just not very many, and still I continued on. So I wonder sometimes, like, if I would have known of more female musicians, jazz musicians growing up when I got into jazz, would have that influenced me anymore? I'm not sure. So for any of you, like, were there any women musicians that were like, you saw them like, this is what I want to do?
Yeah, I had an experience that I remember quite vividly, where I was, I think I was probably around 10 or something, and my dad was playing on a gig and with Terry Lynn Carrington, who's an amazing drummer. And she actually, I had the opportunity to see her again at the CMU Jazz Weekend that we had last year. She was our guest artist, which was amazing. But I remember meeting her for the first time and watching her play. And I guess I was like filled with those like stereotypes of, like women can't be drummers, women can't be jazz musicians. And you didn't see many, like you said. And seeing her do it and do it well, like doing it better than most of the men that I ever saw touch a drum set. I mean, that was a big moment for me that I realized that it's for anyone who wants it bad enough. And that could be me,
And this kind of answers your first question. So the public library was my babysitter growing up, and I was always told that I had a jazzy voice. And so that curiosity really, paved the path of me wanting to listen to different CDs that the library had. And one of the first CDs I was listening to was Jane Monheit, who just sang through the songbook. And that was kind of my first exposure into jazz, and also seeing, as you had just mentioned, a woman doing it really well and honoring the melody and then improvising on top of that. That was really powerful for me to see and hear. And, there are no minority groups, only minoritized groups. It's the same with jazz. Women are not a minority by choice. There's just so many years of implicit bias and limitations that have created the minoritized sex. And I think back to my college experiences and just people that I could see on stage. And I was always introduced by my professors as the lovely Sharon Cho, while I observed my male colleagues being introduced as the very talented. It's subtle words like that, like we emasculate terms like talented, and all that adds to the implicit bias that real jazz musicians are men, and that women jazz musicians are kind of there as decoration. And I think it's just, growing up, I've acknowledged and reflected on my experience as a student, and it was quite exhausting to have that extra layer to be lovely or beautiful. I was given comments of that when I belt, my face isn't as pretty as it should be. I think being mindful of that in the practice room, if I spent all those times in the mirror, just focusing on exploring my voice and sound, I think about that impact a lot, and I think, we just kind of have that double standard we're always kind of working against. I think when men make faces, it's the stank face and it's good and he's feeling the music. And so it has kind of forced me to look out for female musicians so that I can see a mirror in what I do. And so I think, as a note to everyone who is watching, I think words can be so powerful, and there are words that are emasculated that sort of sends an implicit message to female musicians who do want to get into this space and want to be really good at it. But yeah, I think when I look back to people who have influenced me, I think it was kind of the void, the lack thereof, that made me want to go look for more female musicians who looked like me.
Anyone else want to add on that? I can add a lot on that. No. Oh, okay. So yeah, the language thing definitely, or like the always like looking beautiful. I will say I've had more positive experiences than negative. But the negative are there. And I remember getting comments, and I know I don't want to make excuses for them, but I know it wasn't meant maliciously, but people coming up to me like, "Oh, you're really gonna wear that tonight?" And I'm like, "Yep." And like changing my hair, like, "Oh, why'd you dye your hair black? You look so much better as a redhead. Like, why'd you do that? Like, who are you?" Instead of just like, "I'm a bass player. I play bass." Or something that I think can be detrimental to women in jazz is always comparing other women to other women. Like, "Oh, well, she's a female bass player and you're a female bass player." Like, "Oh, are you guys like in competition?" Like, no, we're just here trying to make music. And I definitely feel the language thing. And that's something, again, going back to like research about it, that is something that happens a lot. And like going back to high school experiences, the jazz band program I was a part of was pretty prestigious. We got a lot of awards and won a lot of things. And like thinking back, I didn't think anything weird of it, but we got to play side by side with the Gordon Goodwood Big Band. And the only thing I can remember the bass player telling me was that my hair looked good. And like back then I was like 18, I was like, "Oh," or I was maybe like 17, like, "Thank you." But it's comments like that, like you don't realize they're happening in the moment, and then later on you're like, "Oh wait, yeah, that wasn't okay." and just not being, I never really saw any female musicians. So when I saw Marlene, who's amazing, I was like, oh, I can do this. Like, maybe this can be for me. And I've had a lot of male mentors like help me through it, but not a lot of female mentors, which I don't know if that would have had any impact or not. Does anyone else want to add to any of that? Yeah.
So I've only had one female saxophone teacher. This was when I was a junior and senior in high school. Her name is Stacy Moggins. She teaches at Valparaiso University. And so she, I guess, within classical saxophone is also very male dominated. But I think that saxophone is a little less gendered than other instruments. When you think about, when you think about flute, these are all things that have been put on us, not that we have to internalize them or believe them, but you think about other instruments and you think like, oh, girls play that instrument, boys play that instrument. I feel like saxophone, and maybe this is just my experience, I feel like there's less of that, like, oh, you play saxophone? Not as much of that for me. And so I guess I didn't quite experience that. And I had a female teacher my junior, senior year of high school, which really prepared me to study music in college. And that was really influential for me. It's interesting. I'm through this conversation thinking about like, I didn't really listen to jazz music in middle school or high school. It's kind of funny. I used to listen to like very heavy music, metal, that kind of thing in like middle school, high school, alternative rock, that, kind of all of that. And so it wasn't until a little later that I got more into jazz. I'd say I probably listened to more like R&B type stuff, even maybe before really delving into listening to jazz. And I guess, so I wasn't really looking for, and also like having studied classical music, like so much of the music that I was playing was by people that were no longer alive, or I was listening to like classical saxophonists play the repertoire to like sort of understand like the style, this is the sort of tradition, how this piece is typically played. So I wasn't really looking for people that looked like me playing the music that I was playing. I guess that wasn't really like a thought that I had coming up. And to be honest, I also have to say this too, is my grandmother who raised me she's a chef, and that's also a very male dominated field. And so for me, she really kind of, without really maybe intentionally doing this, just her being like super awesome at what she did. It was never about like, oh, I'm a woman and it's like, no, I'm a really good chef. And that was sort of like this example that I had. And so I didn't really start thinking about my gender within my instrument or, within classical music or jazz and improvised music until maybe college. That just wasn't something that I thought about a lot. And it wasn't until really going to grad school when there was like this big push, women in jazz. And the year that, I started, I think that was the year with the most women in the jazz department at the University of Michigan. And, it was a big conversation, and Ellen Rose, Momentum, Portraits of Women in Motion project. I assisted on that project, and it was all about that. And so that was really my first time sort of being exposed to this, to, really having conversations about there aren't a lot of women in this music, and these are all the reasons systemically why. I think for me, I just wanted to play saxophone, and like that's so much of like my musical upbringing is just like wanting to just be good at my instrument. And probably a big part of that has to do with my grandmother just sort of setting that standard within her craft. And yeah, so it's definitely interesting to talk about this for me, because I almost feel like, well, should I have had those experiences? But that's obviously that's not, really the way to approach that either. But yeah, I guess I had yeah, different, I guess, upbringing musically.
My cat's gonna make an appearance, so just warning you. She woke up. But I think even just having like a female role model that was in a male and like dominate industry, maybe that like shaped your perspective more.
Yeah.
And yeah. So the next question, I guess, can a lot of these just tie in together. What would you state was the best decision you made for your career? And then like we can tie that into another question, like were there any obstacles you faced during your career, because that could tie into like a decision you had to make and how you overcame that.
I can go. So this was passed on to me when I was in college, and it's the phrase, always play with people that are better than you. And I think that has been maybe the best advice and active decision and outreach that has become the best decisions I have made as a musician. And that was kind of built from the obstacles. So to your second part of the question, there's stigma with being a female jazz musician. There's stigma with being a jazz vocalist. When I show up to jams, there's like, oh, is she going to request Fever? Is she not going to, she's not going to want to take a solo, things like that. Or there's stigma of being Asian in the jazz community. I think the landscape has changed a lot since I was in school. We now have Jacob Collier, who's of Chinese descent. But growing up, there wasn't anyone who looked like me at that level. And there's stigma with being a teacher and a musician. And so there's a lot of obstacles there. But I think, to succeed, you just have to be bold enough to perform and put yourself out there in your voice and want to explore and navigate your voice to see the potential. And I don't think you have to say anything. You just have to let your actions speak for themselves, and people will notice, and the way that you perform, you will trickle impact onto the younger generation. It already has. We already see so many more female students in the jazz programs and departments, as it was shared earlier too, I was really lucky to be surrounded by male musicians who did uplift female artists, to have male colleagues who advocate with their actions and hiring you onto gigs. It goes a long way too.
Well, for me, I think maybe obstacles, but I wouldn't say it's an obstacle. It was a blessing for me. I gave 5 births to my kid in about 11 years of period of time when I couldn't do anything. My husband was really busy at that time, and I wanted to have a large family, but then but then I had to take care of my children. So all that period of time, I really, I was just too busy thinking about, raising family. And I think that could be some obstacles for jazz musician or any woman musicians out there. But now that my children, they're growing up, they understand more. And I never thought that I could come back to playing again. But after one really important gig I had, one of my friend, his name is Max Colley, he said, he was just so encouraging to me. He said, you could do it. You could really, you could play, and I want you to keep playing. And that just meant so much to me. After like so many years of not improvising, but coming from a friend who's a musician, just encouraging me like that was a huge blessing to me. So yeah, I guess that was an obstacle, but it was encouragement too.
I think a lot of people sometimes don't know how big of an impact just a few words of encouragement can really do for people, especially like when you're in a very, very like vulnerable position. And, you know, oftentimes when you're like the only woman in a jazz combo or a jazz band, you're in a vulnerable position. It can be kind of daunting to be the only one. So like hearing that, you know, a colleague just saying a few words can, you know, mean the difference between feeling like you are in a place of, you know, like comfort versus, you know, vulnerability. That's interesting. And I remember, and obviously like my career is just, you know, barely even started. Like I'm 20, I'm new to this, and, you know, I can't even really consider myself a woman in jazz yet. I even recently, I always felt that there was this piece of me that all I wanted to do was just prove to people that I can do it too. And that was kind of always the main focus at the front of my mind was, okay, well, this person's looking at me a little weird. Maybe he thinks that I can't do it, or maybe, you know, they don't think that I'm the right person to be on this stage doing what I do. I need to prove to them that I can do it. And thankfully recently I've gotten better at not having that at the forefront of like this just competitive, like, yeah, women can do it, like flaming feminist reaction to everything. But it's kind of hard to not have that. But now it feels like I'm serving the music in my head rather than, you know, serving the expectations of the people around me.
I'm going to unmute myself. This has gone in so many directions, and it's great. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I can identify even though I'm in a different generation and whatnot. Now I'm kind of lost. Like, I don't know which thing to address. You know, like so every one of you said something I could identify with. So I'm going to just grab one. Is that all right, Crystal? All right. Well, maybe I'll just go with the decision that, knowing I was going to do this today, I did spend a little time thinking, thinking about some of these questions, but I thought, you know, what was a decision that I made? And it was just really, really strange. So I graduated with a degree in music composition, by the way. There was no jazz studies. I've never studied jazz in a school, just privately and, you know, whatever. But I had graduated from school and with a music composition degree, and I knew that I wanted to be a musician. I didn't really know how to do that. I mean, I know how to play, sort of, and I had taken some jazz lessons. There wasn't a jazz program, but there was a little bit of jazz instruction. So I had done that in college, and I knew I loved it. And I just kept thinking, I would love to play jazz, but I don't yet. You know, I'm barely beginning the whole thing, and then lo and behold, and this is really weird. Nobody's listening, right? There's nobody out there listening. I was living in a teepee up north, and I did that for a couple of summers, and it was really just because it was free and I needed a place to live. And it was actually kind of fun because I like the outdoors and everything. But anyway, so I'm literally living in this teepee, and my parents show up. Telephone. I mean, there were no cell phones back then. So my parents showed up and they said, Robin, someone's trying to reach you from New York City. I had never been to New York City. I didn't know anyone in New York City. I didn't know what was going on. And so I called, and one of my friends from college had gone to, well, I mean, I did know she was there, but she was in an all-girl band in New York City, and they needed a keyboard player. And so I had to make up my mind because they were going on the road. It was a top 40 band. It was these kind of bands don't exist anymore. It was a lounge band. I mean, it was horrible. I knew I would hate it. But you know, it was like, well, I don't know what else to do. I have to start somewhere, and why not New York City? I mean, you know. But so that's what I did. So I decided I had 1 week between that phone call and moving there, and so I was able to pay off some student loan stuff during the year I did it. I kind of hated every single minute of it. It was tits and ass, pardon the expression, but it was, and in fact, in some ways it might have really done a number on my head because I was in a school with a real feminist point of view. I know if you like makeup, fine, but I've always hated it. I've always hated women's clothing. None of it, man. I'm just, these days, man, I'd probably be like, I don't know, maybe I'm gender something or other, but superficially anyway, I didn't like all the women's stuff. And so all of a sudden I'm in this band where that's what it was about. I mean, totally. And the way I got through it was, for instance, I just thought, I am in a theatrical production. I'm wearing pancake makeup. I'm wearing false eyelashes. Some of the women wore false boobs. I mean, little kit and caboodle. And I'm like, you got to do it. And one thing that worked really well, though, is that I could never have done that where I was living because people would know me. So to me, it was a whole anonymous thing. And I got my paycheck, put it in the bank, went on my way. And the whole rest of the day and everything else was all about jazz, finding people to study with, doing all that. So that's kind of how I got started with it. But that was so hard for me psychologically. And I mean, it's just some of the experiences were really horrible. And then I joined a different band. I kind of started my own with another musician for a year, and that went pretty well. So really the first few years I was working was with all women. And then all my studies were with men, a couple of women like Joanne Breckeen. I studied with her. But anyway, so what was the question? Oh, so that decision, like what the heck would have happened if I hadn't gone to New York? I don't know. But I'm also the only person I've ever met who went to New York like that. Like all the people I know that are into jazz that went to New York, it was like, yeah, I'm going to go be a jazz musician. I was like, I'm going to New York because I have a gig and then I'm going to study jazz. So I did finally eventually get to a point where I played well enough that I was playing jazz gigs and, but I was always making most of my money and, living off of theatrical productions and dance accompanying and playing in restaurants, anything and everything. I sing too. So I sang commercials. I did the phone rang. Yes. So I split myself. This is one other thing that I think might be really interesting because we all do this. I assume everybody has some kind of job other than just, playing jazz or singing jazz, pardon me. So that's what I did, but I did it as a musician. And so I totally had a split personality. I had I did whatever I had to do. If I had to do my hair up and wear the makeup and the high heels, I did that. And I went and played the gig. Like I said, I had this other thing in New York where I was just doing whatever I could creatively and in jazz. And it was very, very possible to do there. Lots and lots of people did it. Here, I found it much harder. I gave up. I just thought it's too hard to have. People know I have carved out a little niche for myself here in Western Michigan as a pianist and a pianist singer who does the American Songbook primarily. I still write a little bit, but not much. And I love it. I mean, it's fine. It's something I've always done, but it was too hard. I kept trying to go back and forth between these different ways in music. And it was just weird, so be careful. Be careful what you ask for. You're young and make sure that you're feeling good about, your voice and what you want to do with it. So, all right, I'm done.
I think that kind of goes to just these extra standards that women have to deal with. There's stories of the all-female jazz bands back in the 20s where they had to show up, they had to wear the dresses, the hair, makeup, everything first, and then the music came second. Not to the musicians, but to the general public. And I think that kind of stigma still is around. And I feel like things are slowly changing, especially with panels like this, just being able to talk about it. So we're coming up to the last question that I have, and then I believe it might be Q&A for the listeners to ask us some questions. So this is kind of a good closing question. Any advice you would have to younger students, primarily female students who are considering pursuing jazz past high school? Anybody?
I kind of just want to reaffirm what I said earlier, but just always be bold enough to play with people better than you. It's such a great learning experience. It's a way to meet people and, to build a community around you and advocates around you. And also one of my favorite quotes is, you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. It's not your responsibility to change things you don't have control over, but what we do have control over is how we respond and how we lead with our actions. And so, when you sing or when you perform on your instrument, just do it with confidence. We're our own worst critics, but be bold and play, and people will hear you. And again, play with people better than you, so you can always be a learner too.
I think I have one. Something that I think is important to remember, I think in music, you don't always get to reap the benefits of like all the work you put in. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get that validation or affirmation that sometimes we kind of so desperately need. And so for young women that really want to seek this out, I mean, just know that the only validation you really need is you, and making sure that you're in this because you want it, and you're feeding the purpose that you want to give it rather than anything else. Any kind of outside perspective, it doesn't have to matter. It's all based off of, you're here for what you want out of it.
I guess I already gave a little advice, but the one this is really not just about pursuing jazz, but it really is about pursuing jazz and everything else. There's a quote that I learned from my husband from a woman, psychologist in the 1950s. Her name was Karen Horney, and the quote is, "Everything boils down to fear versus desire." And I can attribute that to so much life and the decisions that I had to make. And so I was afraid all the time. I didn't think I could do it. My self-confidence was not there. It was just horrendous. And there were, I could go on, I could probably do a whole semester on the problems with men and me not even recognizing it was an issue, because this is so long ago now, and it's not as, I don't think it's nearly as bad now. But when decades later, when I learned that quote, I could go, oh yeah, my desire was so strong. I just kept going. I couldn't not. Someone said, why did you become a musician? I'm like, how could I not? It's just what I wanted. And so, yeah, whether it's jazz or otherwise, everything boils down to fear versus desire. Just think about it. If you fear it too much, you won't do it. If you desire it enough, you will. And they just kind of keep going like this. And actually, I think it's probably healthy to have some of both.
Did you want to say something, Lisa?
Oh, am I still on mute? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Do you want to add anything?
I really agree with what Robin said. That having that desire is what really makes things change. If you're in a bad situation, or in any like a difficult situation you're in, if you have that desire to learn, you could really pursue that goal.
So for me, I feel like surrounding yourself with people who encourage you more than tear you down. I had to learn that the hard way. And as a teacher, I'm always trying to share what I'm doing with my students, inviting them and just showing by example. I think that helps the younger generation. When I went to do my study, I think it was pretty funny. Like, I hopped in on the bass chair just to like play, and there were no female bass players at this school, but then the whole saxophone section was primarily female. They all turned around to like watch me play. And I think just like going out and just doing what you want to do and just showing can have just as much of an impact as talking about it, I think. And it's hard to show a lot now because of COVID, but that was something that I'd like to do. And then finding like certain mentors. And I think having even male mentors, just someone that you can go to. I've been very lucky, like in my experiences, I've dealt with, it's classified as mental abuse from band members and ensembles and outside of ensembles. And I always had like one one mentor that I could go to that I know would always like have my back. And that, I think, especially in my master's, because in my undergrad, I developed severe anxiety around performing due to peers always yelling at me on the bandstand or off the bandstand. It was pretty traumatic to the point where I almost quit. And so then when I started my master's, I was just very lucky that my bass instructor like kept me going. So I think for younger students, like find that one person that you know you can go to. That would be my advice. Any questions from our listeners? Or if anyone, or more from us,
I just wanted to add to advice for younger jazz musicians. Just really reflect on how you're practicing on your own too. You know, when I was younger, I was very selfish as a vocalist in the sense that I just cared about how I sounded on my melody, you know, but now I'm a little older, a little wiser. And, you know, sometimes when I practice, I just play the chords. I just comp myself and try to sing the third of every chord that I'm playing so that I know, you know, the center of the tune sort of in a vertical sense rather than just focusing on that horizontal piece of it. And also I can see like, oh, the note that I'm singing here, that's the seventh of the chord. Maybe I should not belt that out. You know, maybe I should be a little bit, you know, reserved in that note versus if I'm just singing the tonic of a chord, you know. And so, and also vice versa, if you're an instrumentalist, you know, knowing the words, if there are words to your song and the melody is really important, because then you know the purpose and the storytelling behind the chords that you're playing. And so I think just the way that you practice and the way that you're listening to music really impacts the way that you grow as a musician. So that's one of my biggest advices, is just reflect on how you're practicing.
I'd like to add, and I guess this is advice that I would give to a younger self, and things that I've sort of discovered through this process of sort of leaving this like classical trajectory of you go to grad school, get your master's degree in saxophone, get a PhD, you teach at a college level, sort of breaking away from that and exploring the avenue. The next avenue is being unapologetic, being fearless. It's easier said than done, of course. But, you know, our voices are all valid in whatever form that takes. And I guess for me, like taking risks has been a big part of my growth, be it musically or personally, just sort of pushing myself to get out of my comfort zone. I wouldn't be on this panel if I stayed sort of in my lane of, you know, the trajectory that I was on. My master's degree, so I got my master's at the University of Michigan, but it's not a master's in jazz. It's a master of music in improvisation. And so it's a lot more open-ended. And I had never, until I met, you know, the saxophone professor at University of Michigan, I had never really thought about leaving that. I had never, you know, I was comfortable. This is, you know, saxophone, classical saxophone is what I knew. And had I not taken that risk, I wouldn't be here now. I wouldn't feel like I'm as close to my voice now as I was when I was a child improvising. So really just, you know, your voice is so valid. And it's, you know, this is a reminder to myself, being within a jazz department and being, you know, kind of a free improviser, feeling like I have no validity here. And that's not the case. You know, our voices are valid, and to really just be unapologetic in whatever form that your voice takes, just being fearless and knowing that, you know, there's a reason why you're here in this room or wherever it may be, that you're valid, your voice is valid, and to really be unapologetic in saying what you have to say using your voice.
Can I just say real quick that I appreciated that as like a student who's like currently an undergrad and like experiencing a lot of those like pushes and pulls of like where my career is going to go. At CMU, we also don't have a jazz degree. There's really no big thing that says like, hey, go seek out other genres of music. It's mostly just, you know, you're studying that classical repertoire and you're going, and I mean, I'm studying trumpet performance. That's my major. And there's nothing really more specific about it. It's just trumpet performance. And so having to be able, like having the ability to listen to what you want and go out and look for those opportunities within jazz or within, like right now, like I'm learning a lot more about Latin music because one, it's just, it's in my roots and I want to learn more about that side of me and my culture and my family. But above that, it's just, what music do you like? What music do you want to learn? What music do you want to play? And so, you know, hearing that you don't necessarily have to fit into any dichotomy of your own future or the people or the different paths that people took before you. I mean, that's a good message to remember and something that I need to keep in mind too.
So we're going to have questions from listeners. I teach at a performing arts high school. How can I make sure that I'm fostering an uplifting environment for all my students? Yeah, someone else can go. This is basically my dissertation. So if anyone else wants to comment first.
If I could say something, so through grad school for me, you know, being kind of open-ended, improvisation, and really finding my voice as an improviser. Doing that, I in a band that I was in, we did free improvisation workshops where we went to, we got a grant to go into schools and sort of workshop this. And so what we did was these students were, I mean, I've had a little bit of experience with this beyond this one particular experience that I'm talking about, but we were in an after-school band program where most of the students were 6th grade, but most of them really didn't have a lot of experience on their instruments yet. And so for us, it was a lot about like play and about removing, you know, music, taking music out of the equation and just letting the students create freely. And I think I've tried some of that with some of my private students, and the way that they respond to that is like they open up and they become way more inquisitive when it's not just about the music on the page and playing your instrument right or not. I really think so much of the schooling, the education system is about falling in line, about, you know, this is the way things are done. And, you know, kids are kids, you know, over time, I think we're conditioned to sort of not be as creative and not, you know, think outside the box. That's like something that kids do, right? That's sort of like how we're conditioned. And I really think that adding that element of play into you know, your instruction, you know, you might be working on a piece in band or in orchestra or in choir because you have a concert, but they're still kids, and kids are creative and kids want to have fun. And I think that really just, you know, keeping that part of what you do, as well as playing music, as well as really focusing on their skills on their instruments, is so important and so inspiring. And I think that that can plant seeds, you know, for someone to be able to discover their voice. Like, wow, I played this note on the clarinet that I didn't know I could play. Or for me, in a saxophone lesson one time, it was a 5th grade student, and you know, we were just freely improvising together, and he played a high F on saxophone effortlessly because he wasn't thinking about it, because it was just, you know, it was playful. It was, you know, you can explore and play whatever note you want, however you want to play. And I think that is really important when working with youth, is to really just remind them that they can still be kids while pursuing, you know, music and reading music and learning their instruments.
I also just wanted to add, you coming on here and asking that question, like that alone too, is a great step. I think one of the best things we can do as educators is to acknowledge our implicit biases. Our implicit bias, that's a natural thing. You don't have control over it. It's based off of our schemas and our own experiences. But acknowledging it and being mindful of that, does impact your students. And I also think just Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings came up with a term called culturally relevant teaching. And in that, the foundation really is that your students succeed because of you. And so it really starts with the belief that you give your students, that you allow that permission for them to succeed because you know that they're going to succeed, and you acknowledge and vocalize that potential for them first. And so I think, with that, just that and being able to have uncomfortable conversations, I think just the space and, again, the permission to have those conversations is so powerful. I think the willingness to be disturbed is really impactful. One of my favorite quotes comes from Margaret Willey, and she talks about, well, if what you're saying disturbs me, then I must believe the opposite to be true. And so having those uncomfortable conversations can be an act of reflection. And I think that's just a great environment and culture that you can build for your students. But again, thank you for even asking that question. I think that's a great first step.
Okay. Where do you see the future of this music going, especially in terms of equity? Anybody?
I can say something. Not just anything, but I do have my own answer to this. I think, like, we talked a little bit about it earlier, that like sometimes we forget the roots of where jazz comes from and where like the blues comes from, and like this is all coming from a place of oppression, a place of like where diversity wasn't accepted in this world. So we have to find a place to say what we want to say, in a place where it's safe, and in a place where we can say what we want. And jazz is a beautiful way to express yourself. I mean, music in general is just a beautiful way to express yourself in an artistic view of who we are. And so I think that in terms of this genre of music, I hope that it will continue to do that and be a place where people can express themselves freely. And I think that will continue to kind of morph into new things, and people start to create more weird electronic sounds that, create jazz fusion and all of those great things. But yeah, I think that it'll continue to accept people from all places, and it'll take a lot of work to make people feel comfortable in like the establishment of it all. But on a small scale, at least, just playing music is freeing for me.
Anyone else want to add to this one?
I'm not sure what Kevin means specifically by equity. In what way he's using the term. To me, it's making me think, though, about how jazz is like other music, classical music, for instance. One of the things that blows my mind and is really exciting and beautiful to me is how it's embraced worldwide to varying degrees. And I think I've understood this more because of my stepson, who works all over the world and with musicians from all over the world. So it's given me a little, even though I'm not with him, I mean, I get a little firsthand. That's not firsthand. Anyway, I get glimpses of it in a way that I don't by just reading about it in Downbeat or something, and I mean, part my stepson, but I really do love his music. With some groups more than others, but I go and listen to them online sometimes, and I get that exposure. So that's not the question. I'm sorry, Kevin. I know that's not. I know you weren't talking about equity in that sense, but it made me think of that, about how broad it's become now. how you address anything related to that, and then equity of different types of people, or whatever. I don't know. Now, if I think of the word equity and I'm thinking of women, it continues to distress me that I see so few women in academia. And yet, I would really not want to be the chair of a department and be required to hire a woman, or a minority of any kind. You know what I mean? And also, like, I have a friend who's African American woman who's in music. And I remember when she got her new job, as a professor, and it was like, I don't want to think I've been being hired because I'm Black or because I'm, what I mean? Of course, nobody wants that. So it's a hard thing, I think, to negotiate as we go forward. In that the people in the hiring, the people who want the job, all those things, there's all the different perspectives, and they're all part of it. So I went in two different directions there. You see, this is so typical for me. I'm thinking of the big picture and kind of the little picture all at the same time. Kevin, I have no idea if that was anything what you were talking about.
Well, just to add to that, I think because of internet and YouTube, it's where this music, if Kevin means by jazz, I think it's gonna really like stretch out to like world music too. Like if we just click, like how does like African drum sound? Within just few seconds we can access that. We can just hear it. So that that accessibility will just really help us, and I think it's gonna. My students, they come to my studio and say, "Oh, teacher, I have this. Mrs. Song, I have this. I'm listening to chill hop. Do you know what this is?" And I listen to it. I'm like, "Yeah, it's so cool." Like I'm just exposed to like so much more, and it's just such a wonderful thing. So it's gonna expand, I think, to world music too.
And if I could add, oh, sorry, we changed the question. But so my master's degree was in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the educational sense, equity means that you're identifying gaps and you're identifying the supports needed so that people have equal success.
Oh.
And, I think about that as it relates to jazz. And I don't think there is enough, identifying the supports needed so that women have the equal opportunities to succeed. And so I wish there were more female professors in jazz communities and in universities. And I wish there was better representation. But as it was mentioned earlier, there is easier access to see women role models, via YouTube or different streaming services. So I think in that sense, it is getting easier, and just the representation is there. I see in your comments, Kevin, that you also wrote equal pay. That is actually one thing that I haven't noticed a large gap in. For when we perform as a combo, we kind of just get a lump sum and it's distributed with all the members. And so I'm getting the same pay as, someone who's playing drums or piano. And so in that sense, I have seen equal pay, but as it relates to equity and really figuring out what the supports are, and identifying what's needed to make sure that women do have the equal opportunities, I don't think we're quite there yet to say, I don't even think we've really begun to identify those gaps quite yet. And conversations like this, I think, is a great starter.
If I could add on that too, these gaps are larger than just within music. These gaps exist just in the regular classroom, the way that girls versus, boys in the classroom are treated. And it's like, I feel like the root of the issue is not in music. Music, I think, is sort of a reflection of the larger issue. And so, yeah, we haven't really addressed these issues, the gaps, because they're so much larger than just the arts.
All right, we're gonna take this is be the last question for the night, and then yeah. So recordings are albums that keep you inspired and motivated, especially during COVID. I'm gonna add that.
Well, I'll go. Anyone who knows me knows I'm obsessed with Gretchen Parlato. She's sort of my idol forever. And yeah, so I'm a big fan of Gretchen Parlato, and she has a ton of albums that are just so great. And I'm also a big fan of Nate Smith, and he has an album called Kinfolk, and I recommend checking that out too. I think just the way that he plays is so vocal, and it's technique and musicality, and I just really love that whole album. So those are two musicians that are kind of keeping me inspired and motivated right now, is Gretchen Parlato and Nate Smith.
One of my artists right now that I'm kind of into is Freddie Hubbard's Red Clay album. Something I keep going back to. So I'm having like my junior recital in a month. And one of the tunes that my combo will be playing is Delphia on that album. And it's a tune that kind of switches from like a ballad feel to a waltz. And I really like it. Like, I really, really like it. And I'll just like listen to it in the car and really get into like this weird, like existential zone. And in a time right now where like there's a lot of solitude and just a lot of like feeling really stuck in a rut, it's really good to have like a tune or like a whole album that you really like keeps you feeling like you really want to go pick up your instrument. And like that's something that's keeping me in the practice room, really shedding and like transcribing solos and doing something that'll like really make me a better musician during a time where I really don't want to do anything.
For me, Jerry Allen, one of her album, 21. Every time I listen to it, I'm so inspired and motivated. And because I just played a concert at CMU of all Thelonious Monk tunes, I've been listening to him a lot. So all his records are just amazing.
Anyone else?
Yeah, an album that really, I guess, especially because I heard it really early into like my transition into like, exploring my voice as a free improviser. Live at the Plug Nickel, Miles Davis. But also there's some other albums of his that are really in that vein too. And so just sort of like that was my entry point into some of that. And so that definitely like keeps me inspired. I love just revisiting that and like listening to new things, hearing new things each time. And if I could also say something that's not jazz, because yeah, I like to listen to a lot of like R&B, neo soul type stuff. An artist that I have found and I really delved into actually during COVID, although I'd heard her music before, but I didn't quite like put two and two together that it was her. Her name is Michelle Ndegeocello.
Mm-hmm.
Her music, especially her earlier albums, I'd say from her debut in '93 up to like the 2010s or so. She's prolific actually, and she's done a lot of different things within her artistry, and I think that is part of why I feel so inspired by her. So I might write that in the comments just because the spelling of her name is very unique. So I'll type that in.
Mike, could you say your name? I something has happened twice now with my computer where I lose everything and then I come back in. So who were you just talking about?
Her name is Michelle Ndegeocello, and I'm not sure if I can type that into the comments. I'll type it in here. But
I was bummed that I couldn't see or hear anybody for a few minutes there. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Maria Schneider. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I got to sing with her. She came here to Grand Rapids, I don't know when, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And we know each other a little bit from New York. And and so I love that kind of singing. I you know, where there were no words. It's called vocalese or something, but no improvising either. I can't stand to improvise on vocal. That's not me at all. So so it's just, I mean, I'm sitting in the saxophone section and just, you know, in blending in. It was so cool. But aside from that, I just love her music. So I go back to her music sometimes. And then the other one that I'm always going back to is Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, and the things that have spawned from that. And I had the amazing, wonderful experience of studying with Bob Brookmeyer for 2 years. So I, you know, that brings back memories of all that too. And I love his music. So notice that I'm not mentioning piano players, but there's those two. I definitely, Aaron Parks is a young one that, well, kind of millennial, that I really like a lot. And Chick Corea, I hadn't listened to him for years, I admit. And recently I've gotten way back into that again. It's like, wow. So it changes. It changes. There isn't one thing. It just seems to go from one to the next.
So we're coming to a close. Is there anything anyone else wants to add before we say goodbye?
You know what? I'm so glad I have so much of this behind me. But I get sad sometimes because I you know, sometimes oh gosh, and you hear older people say, if I knew then what I know now, right? So you'll probably do that too. Hopefully you'll have lots of blessings and you'll feel that way too. But yeah, I just, it's been great to meet you all, and I hope to meet each of you maybe in person. Some of you are not that far away. Lisa, can't wait to see you again. So
Thank you so much for this. I had such a wonderful time meeting you all. Thank you for the moderating.
yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank
You're
you.
welcome.
It's so nice to meet all of you as well. And hopefully we can find each other on social media or just in the real world when when we can do things in the real world again. So yeah.
Yeah, it was great meeting all of you for sure. And thanks to Jordan for throwing this together. And that concludes our panel. I don't have anything else to say. It's been great. Hopefully we'll all meet each other one day.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.